close your eyes. Now take a deep breath. Try to imagine a world bathed not in the darkness of forgotten ideas, but in the ceaseless illumination of ancient wisdom. Imagine a world where the Library of Alexandria, the greatest treasure house of human thought, was never destroyed. The flames that once erased centuries of human achievement never touched its walls. The ignorance that followed never had a chance to rise. Instead, what followed was an unbroken chain of learning, creation, and discovery that reshaped the very soul of civilization. In this world, scrolls did not vanish into ash. They lived, and through them, humanity lived differently. Here, history did not stutter, it did not fall, it soared, because knowledge is a living thing. And in this timeline, the fire never came. The Library of Alexandria, founded in the 3rd century BCE, was more than a building. It was an idea. It was humanity's first great monument to collective understanding. A place where Egyptian priests, Indian mathematicians, Chinese alchemists, Persian astronomers, and Greek philosophers met not as strangers, but as seekers of the same truths. In our world, their works vanished, victims of war, politics, fear, but not here. Here, the rulers of Alexandria, followed by scholars and diplomats, treated the library as sacred. When Rome rose to power, instead of viewing Alexandria as a prize to be looted, they made it a crown jewel of the Republic's intellectual ambitions. Emperors, recognizing the value of wisdom over weapons, funded new wings, translated more texts, and sent emissaries to collect knowledge from as far as sub-Saharan Africa, Scandinavia, and Southeast Asia. And knowledge began to stack, not in ruins, but in foundations. By 100 CE, engineering was no longer a regional strength, it was a global discipline. The Chinese wheelbarrow and Greek gears merged into powerful, efficient mechanical systems. Water pumps irrigated entire regions. Agriculture flourished. Hunger became rare. Cities began to develop not just around ports or palaces, but around learning centers inspired by Alexandria's open model. By 300 CE, natural philosophy, what we now call science, had already developed a structured method. Observations were recorded, tested, refined, and published. Paper imported from China became widespread in the Roman and Persian worlds. The concept of peer review was born earlier than we could ever imagine. The steam engine, Heron's curious invention in our history, evolved into a working technology. It powered small mills, then textile machines. By 400 CE, entire cities used mechanical power for basic manufacturing. Rail systems were envisioned to connect large trade hubs, not built yet, but theorized, not fiction, but forecast. By 500 CE, collaboration between Indian mathematicians and Persian thinkers led to early models of calculus. The numeral 0, already revered in India, was now universally taught across the academic world. Astronomy was advancing rapidly. The heliocentric model wasn't heresy, it was consensus. Telescopic lenses had begun to emerge, and the moons of Jupiter were charted. And still, the fire had not come. By 700 CE, the Islamic Golden Age expanded not as an isolated phenomenon, but as a natural continuation of the Alexandrian tradition. Muslim scholars translated not just Greek texts, but Chinese, Indian, and African works already preserved in the Great Library. Cordoba and Baghdad became twin beacons of knowledge linked by intellectual trade and mutual respect. A global network of libraries was established, each contributing to a shared archive. Scholars travelled freely across continents, respected not for their birth, but for their ideas. By 900 CE, a primitive but working model of electricity was understood. Galvanic reactions were documented. The first theoretical treatises on magnetism were being debated. In China, compass navigation became intertwined with physics lessons from Alexandrian scrolls. The Indian surgical techniques of Sushruta were being refined with antiseptic techniques inspired by Egyptian embalming knowledge. Knowledge was no longer a luxury. It was a right. By the year 1000, the world was already seeing mechanical computation. Crude, yes, but real. Analog calculators helped track planetary movements and solve complex algebraic equations. These devices, though mechanical, were the ancestors of what we'd later call computers. And because knowledge was accessible to many, not just elites, these tools became more widespread, evolving faster than they ever did in our world. And still, the fire had not come. By 1100, steam-powered vessels were navigating the Mediterranean and Indian Ocean. Trade networks had expanded into a vast global system. Europe was no longer in the so-called Dark Ages because they had never begun. Religious intolerance and scientific censorship were rare. Theocracies and empires still rose and fell, but scholars remained above politics, protected by a global reverence for the learned. Education had become universal. Literacy rates exceeded 70% in many regions. Women had entered universities by 1200. Debates between feminist philosophers and traditionalists were commonplace, not because women were silenced, but because their voices had always been heard. The concept of equal access to education wasn't a modern dream, it was a centuries-old reality. By 1300, technological development entered a golden age. Telescopes scanned the skies, and observatories dotted mountaintops in Africa, Persia, Tibet, and the Andes. A shared calendar, based on precise astronomical measurements, united timekeeping systems across civilizations. A common metric system was adopted, created by a consortium of mathematicians from Alexandria, Nanjing, and Delhi. Electric lighting began to illuminate homes in 1350, powered by simple dynamos connected to running water or windmills. Steam engines had evolved into locomotives. Rail networks connected India, Persia, the Mediterranean, and northern Europe. Airships, guided by magnetic compasses and altimeters, offered early passenger flights. While crude, they were real, and still, the fire had not come. By 1400, a prototype of the printing press, developed from Chinese woodblock techniques and enhanced by Alexandrian engineers, allowed books to flood the world. 1 million copies of foundational texts, science, ethics, history, literature were in circulation. With mass access to knowledge came mass creativity. Artistic movements exploded. Cultural fusion was the norm, not the exception. By 1500, human flight was no longer legend. It was experiment. Parachutes had already been tested. Gliders were common. And by 1550, powered flight had taken off. Literally, propelled by combustion engines fueled with distilled alcohol and oils, early flying machines took to the skies over Cairo, Athens, and Samarkand. And it was not war that inspired them, it was curiosity. By 1600, the moon was no longer just a mystery in the sky. It was a target. Telescopic observatories had mapped its surface in staggering detail. Plans for reaching it were drafted, not as fantasies, but as engineering puzzles. International teams of scientists collaborated on spacecraft models, guided by centuries of shared learning, and still the fire had not come. By 1650, electricity powered cities. Medical science had already embraced germ theory. Vaccinations had eliminated smallpox. Hospitals were clean, organized, and respected as centers of healing, not places of despair. Mental illness was no longer taboo, but a studied field. Human anatomy was understood down to the cellular level. Microscopes had revealed a hidden universe, and humanity had responded not with fear, but with fascination. By 1700, the internet had begun, not as we know it, but as a global knowledge-sharing network. Using early forms of digital computation and electromagnetic transmission, libraries connected across continents. People in Japan could read papers written in Africa in seconds. Debates between indigenous philosophers in the Americas and Buddhist monks in Tibet were broadcast to public screens in Paris and Alexandria. Politics evolved too. Democracy had become more participatory. With an educated populace, manipulation was harder. Tyranny still existed, but it didn't last long. Truth moved faster than fear. Censorship was difficult not because it was illegal, but because it was obsolete. Information had become too decentralized to silence, and still the fire had not come. By 1800, humanity had landed on the moon. A multicultural crew of scientists, engineers, poets, and biologists descended on the lunar surface. They did not plant a single flag, but a sculpture, a golden tree, its roots inscribed with 1,000 languages, its branches pointing toward the stars. Mars followed in 1850. Colonies began in underground domes. Not because of overpopulation or desperation, but because humanity was curious. Was life out there? Could we grow plants in alien soil? Could we terraform? Could we build, not empires, but communities? And still the fire had not come. By 1900, Earth was a connected planet. Languages were many, but understanding was universal. Cultural differences were celebrated. Religion was not gone. It had evolved. Interfaith councils replaced crusades. Theology and science walked hand in hand. Where once we saw division, now we saw layers, different paths leading to the same mountaintop. Environmental preservation was no afterthought. The value of the natural world was taught from the earliest age. Forests were protected not by laws, but by love. Renewable energy had been standard since 1600. Carbon emissions were near zero by 1900. The oceans were clean. Species lost in our timeline still thrived here, and still the fire had not come. By 2000, artificial intelligence had not replaced humanity, it had enhanced it. AI systems taught children, assisted the elderly, helped artists, guided researchers, and translated languages in real time. Machines weren't feared because ethics had always grown alongside capability. Responsibility had always been part of progress, and by now humanity looked outward, not for escape but for expansion of meaning. Deep space telescopes had begun recording messages, patterns, perhaps from other civilizations. But instead of rushing to respond with pride or panic, humanity responded with patience and wisdom. We knew any civilization advanced enough to speak across stars would not judge us by our technology, but by how we treated each other. And in this world, this alternate path birthed from a single choice to preserve a library, we had learned to treat each other better. But here's the twist. This isn't a dream. Fragments of this world live in us still. Every library, every school, every search engine, every child who asks why, they are echoes of Alexandria. The fire may have come in our past, but the future is still unwritten. We can choose again, we can build again, not in stone but in spirit, not in silence but in shared voices. Because the question is no longer just, what if the Library of Alexandria had never been destroyed? The question is, what if we decide to rebuild it now? What if the fire never comes again? What if we, this generation, become the guardians of wisdom, not rulers of knowledge, but students of the universe, forever reaching, forever learning, forever connected?